Welcome. This is Team 10, and we will present to you the differences and the similarities between a consumer bank, an investment bank, and a merchant bank, and how they interact with each other. These are the logos we will use throughout the whole presentation, the first being a consumer bank, the second an investment bank, and the third a merchant bank. First, we will start off with some definitions. Then we will go on with the history of these three banks, and then we will use an example. Let's start off. Once upon a time, there was this girl called Brit.
It's Kathy, Krista, not Brit.
Oh, sorry, Kathy. And she earned a lot of money through an inheritance from her grandmother. Kathy has a lot of investment opportunities, being option number 1, a personal investment. Imagine she has a lack of financial expertise, and given the current financial crisis, she decided to buy an apartment. She's looking for different possibilities and found a really nice apartment in Shanghai. Guess what? Next to the health campus. A really great location. If she would go for this option, she would receive an amount of money per month. Option number 2 would be to cooperate with the banks. But which banks? The first bank Kathy can consider to deposit her money would be the consumer bank. This bank deals with consumers and small businesses rather than large companies and other banks. So Kathy can deposit her money with the consumer bank. The main function of a consumer bank is to receive money from people with excess, and to then lend it on to people with a shortage in money. Or actually, no money. More specifically, it performs financial services such as managing your savings, granting mortgages, personal loans for cars, and dealing with credit and debit cards. Kathy will receive a moderate interest rate depending on the state of the economy. A second bank Kathy can invest her money in is an investment bank. An investment bank deals with investors with capital, pension funds, and companies. Kathy can either choose to invest directly in an investment bank or buy a share of a pension fund. Its main function is very simple. Take money and then magically transform it into more money. It performs different financial services, such as facilitating mergers and other corporate reorganizations by offering consultancy. A second is asset management, and a third function is acting as an intermediary between an issuer of securities and the investing public. If Kathy chooses to invest in this investment bank, she will get a return on investment. The third bank in which Kathy can invest is a merchant bank. A merchant bank deals with companies, but in a very exclusive way. So if Kathy wants to deal with this merchant bank, she first has to raise her own company. And as everybody knows, companies need a lot of money. Money for personnel and for equipment, for example. So merchant bank deals with companies in a very exclusive way. Instead of borrowing money to companies in the form of loans, which is what a commercial bank does, it invests its own capital into companies in exchange for equity. Its financial services mainly comprise of providing long-term loans to companies for foreign investment, then mergers and acquisition, and the further execution of an international growth strategy. If Kathy chooses this option, equity will increase in her company and hence her dividends will increase as well. After giving you the different definitions of the three banks, we can ask ourselves, how do we get there? Now we will give you a bit of history between the existence of the three banks. We will split this up in 4 different periods: the pre-Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, the Industrial Age, and the Modern Age. In the pre-Middle Ages, people saved their money in temples because it was considered as the most safe place on earth. These temples were considered to be guarded by the gods. In the Middle Ages, there were merchants with a lot of excess in money, and there were farmers without money. So what did the merchants do? They brought these two facts together, and that resulted in lots of food, such as carrots and tomatoes. Consequently, the interaction between farmers and merchants led to the creation of the merchant bank. At the same time, there were these goldsmiths in England who were carrying around large amount of gold. And they had to put it somewhere, right? So where better to put it than in a safe? Now consumers were seeing this and thought about doing the same thing. So they deposited their gold with the goldsmith. And the goldsmith saw that these investors wouldn't need their money back right away. So what did he do? He would invest it out for a small interest rate, and this was the creation of the consumer bank. Still in the Middle Ages, some of the biggest names in banking were the Templars and the families such as Peruzzi and Medici. These Templars and the international connections of these families took banking to an international level, as they had multiple temples or banks across Europe. So it was possible for a consumer to deposit money in a bank in Belgium and then withdraw it in a bank in Italy. So families would dominate banking from the Middle Ages into the Industrial Age, with prominent families such as the Rothschilds and the Warburgs.
It's Rothschilds and Warburgs, Krista. Germans conquering the world.
Even though these families did a lot of work in Europe, they are best known for some of their work they did in the US. The US around the Industrial Age had a great need for infrastructure and not enough funds for such projects. So these families would partner up with wealthy investors and then perform an intermediary role, raising money from wealthy investors from all over the world to then finance these projects in the US. Projects such as railroads and bridges. These partnerships would then lead to the creation of investment banks as we know it. So everything ran smoothly until the 1930s when the Great Depression hit in. So what happened was that regulators would step in because this could never happen again. So what did they do? They inaugurated the Securities and Exchange Commission to oversee the stock exchange. Moreover, they introduced the Glass-Steagall Act, which is a very important act that states that investment banks cannot use consumers' money for risky investments. So everything went well and there was a lot of prosperity. So what happens when everything is going well and prosperity and money is rising? People forget. This was what happened with the investors and the bankers. They simply thought that this time is different. So what did they do was that they exercised their lobbying powers and decreased the power of the regulators. Consequence is deregulation. Let me give a quick analogy. Before the 1970s, if you would have a container ship, regulation would be represented by the different partitions in a container ship, making up for different compartments. So if water would flow in one compartment, it would not affect the others. What deregulation did was removing these partitions, so if water would flow into one compartment, it would affect the whole ship and make it more prone to sinking. An example of deregulation would be the introduction of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which pretty much undid the Glass-Steagall Act. So now it was possible for investment banks to use consumers' money for risky investments. So the lines between the different banks became thinner and more blurred. So are these banks interconnected or not connected? That's the question.
Shakespeare.
Now let's give an example and look at the current financial crisis that started in 2008. Imagine this happy family with Kathy, bodyguard Stefan, and little Johnny. They are dreaming about building a house. A large house with lots of windows, but they don't really have enough money for it. So what can they do? Well, if you paid attention, they can move to the consumer bank and give them a call. This consumer bank would then grant them a mortgage depending on their income. And then the investment bank came into the picture, and what they did was buying up these mortgages with large amounts of money. As the market for these mortgages was very huge, they didn't have enough capital, so they went to borrow from the commercial bank. Quick definition, the commercial bank is a consumer bank, but instead of focusing on consumers, it focuses on other banks and companies. The investment bank would then take these mortgages and put them with other mortgages in a box called a collateral debt obligation, after which they would slice and dice them in AAA, BBB, and trash securities. Then they would sell them to investors and other capital banks, such as consumer banks and commercial banks. They would pay money for these securities, and that money would then go back to the investment bank, and the investment bank would repay its loan to the commercial bank. Everything was going well. So when everything is going well, people become more greedy. So the investment bank would start borrowing more money from the commercial bank, but there wouldn't be more mortgages that the consumer bank could sell. So what would happen is that the consumer bank would lower its benchmark for people to get loans and get mortgages, and to then sell those subprime mortgages back to the investment bank. So what would happen when these families couldn't pay their mortgages anymore?
Honey, we're losing the house. I need a cigarette.
The consequence would be that the collateral debt obligations would become worthless. So the investment bank was unable to sell them to the investors because the investors simply didn't want to buy it anymore. So the money that normally would flow from the investor to the investment bank and then to the commercial bank would not flow anymore. Moreover, nobody knew how exposed everybody was, so borrowing and lending froze. Consequence, a financial gridlock.
So